The Canadian Grand Prix served us up with what, in my opinion, is probably the greatest podium in the history of Formula 1. You had the most successful driver of all time, you had the greatest designer of all time, you had the most adaptable driver of all time, and then the current dominant force and the best driver of his generation. And now, we have seen great podiums in F1 before. Just once in history, in 1993 we had Prost, Senna and Schumacher all on the same podium, but that was at a time when Schumacher wasn't even a world champion yet, and so it's more a legendary podium in hindsight because of what one of the drivers then went on to achieve. Same goes for podiums with Vettel, Alonso and Hamilton, as at the time, Lewis was only a one-time world champion, and so in the same way, it's again a more legendary podium looking back at what the driver then went on to achieve. Canada just felt different. We had 3 all-time great drivers, all in their absolute prime, and compared to Australia earlier in the season, or when you then just add Adrian Newey to that podium as well, if you include all of the races that his cars have won and how many Constructors' Championships he's won as well, you had 376 Grand Prix wins between them and a combined 22 championships at that very moment shared between the 4 of them. Despite the fact that this year we have a dominant car up at the front, I really do think that more than ever before we're seeing the really great drivers make more of a difference, and in particular I think the level that Max, Fernando and Lewis are operating at genuinely makes me feel like right now, those drivers are in a league of their own in Formula 1. In terms of Max, I'm not saying that he's got a very tough title fight on his hands, or even to be honest that he has any sort of title fight on his hands really, but apart from all the winning that he's doing that's obviously impressive in itself, it's the way he manages to get the most out of every single run that impresses me most. The best way that I can describe it is that because Max is so consistent on every single run, every lap that he does throughout qualifying always puts him at least in the top 2 or 3 at worst. Or what that means is that he's never opening the door for disaster to strike, and he's never putting himself in a position where external variables are going to have an effect on him, and he's never in a position where there's a huge amount of pressure for him to deliver that one lap to save a session. In Monaco, Max needed to do that incredible lap to pull something out of the bag because, in the end, he still only outqualified Alonso by just over 0.08 of a second. Miami was actually the only exception of when things can and did go wrong. During the first runs in Q3, Max made a mistake and actually didn't even set a provisional lap. In that case, he opened the door for disaster and to get caught out, and when Leclerc crashed out and ended qualifying early, that is exactly what happened. Max just doesn't let this happen that often, and that's in complete contrast with his teammate, with Checo, who keeps getting caught out. In Spain and Canada, his banker laps in tricky conditions for whatever reason have not been good enough, which have left him further down the order. And when he has to pull out a pressure lap to save his session, he just hasn't been able to do it. He opens the door for disaster to happen, which has bitten him in the past 2 races, and then that just leaves him on constant recovery drives to get back into the points. Like Max, it feels like Fernando is leaving absolutely nothing on the table. Spain was the only race where he was compromised due to a mistake that he made, but other than that, 6 podiums in 8 races. He has had 4 front row starts as well, and now he is just 9 points behind Checo in the fight for second in the championship. This season for Fernando is really starting to remind me of 2020, where in that case, it was Max in an inferior car chasing down Valtteri in second, and in the end finishing just 9 points behind Valtteri. In a weird way, what Alonso is doing now, with a genuine possibility of beating Checo in the championship, is almost more impressive. And now, granted, Valtteri in a Mercedes is a better driver than Checo is in a Red Bull, but in 2020 the RB16 was a little bit closer to the Mercedes W11 than the current Aston Martin is to the RB19. And on top of that, unlike in 2020 where the Red Bull had a clear advantage over the rest of the field, the Aston Martin on some weekends has been slower than both the Ferrari and also the Mercedes. Regardless of which season is better, what makes Alonso still so good is, first and foremost, the motivation. In Formula 1, most drivers, as they get older, they don't lose the speed, they lose the need. They lose that want-it factor, they lose that fire in their eyes, and with Fernando Alonso, there is never a question of commitment or motivation. The raw speed and racecraft is still there, and whether it's in dry conditions like in Monaco, almost grabbing pole position, or wet conditions like in Canada, just like Max, he is always there. In the races, his consistency is just a joke. Mistakes like the one that he made in Spain stand out so much because Fernando barely ever makes mistakes anyway. What's also incredible when you watch him race is how much spare mental capacity he has outside of racing. It always seems like actually driving is like the third or fourth thing in the back of his mind, but that sort of awareness just allows him to be a much more complete driver than most. In terms of Lewis, I actually feel like there's not too much to say. We have seen his quality over the years when he was winning 7 world championships, and now that the team and the car is much more stable, we're seeing that same speed and that same quality, but just in the midfield. There is no doubt that the car has been a little bit tricky at times with how difficult they find it to warm up their tyres. That has actually led to both of the Mercedes drivers at times going out in Q2. Despite that, the team led by Lewis currently sits second in the constructors ahead of Aston Martin, and whilst a large part of that is because Aston Martin is basically a one-car team, Lewis's consistency to always be able to grab the big results when the car has been capable, like in Australia and Spain, but then still be there fighting for the podium when it's not, has been a big reason why the team is actually in a better place than the car really should be. So, what about the other drivers who aren't on the same level as Lewis, Fernando and Max? Well, in terms of Checo and Sainz, whilst they are really good drivers, they neither have that ultimate raw speed, nor the ability to do it consistently under pressure. It doesn't make them bad drivers by any means. It's just the difference between good drivers and all-time greats. Russell and Leclerc, however, are a lot closer and I'm sure in some people's eyes are on the same level. It has to be said that alongside Lewis, one of the reasons why Mercedes are ahead of Aston Martin in the championship is also down to Russell. George on his day is more than capable of beating drivers like Alonso and Hamilton, but it does seem that after a tricky 2022, Lewis has just gone up a level which so far, George just hasn't been able to match in 2023. Although Russell has been involved in some wheel-to-wheel shenanigans with other drivers in the past, in terms of individual unforced errors, I wouldn't say that he's particularly crash-prone. What happened in Canada and even Monaco to an extent, spinning in tricky conditions, I don't think that that's the norm for Russell. But as rare as those mistakes are, those tiny mistakes that have big consequences are the difference so far. Leclerc, however, is arguably the most controversial to not be included in that top echelon. Unlike Sainz or Checo, Leclerc undoubtedly has that raw speed, and I have said this on multiple times that I genuinely think over a single lap, he is probably the quickest driver in Formula 1, all things being the same. But we have seen over the past couple of seasons that, in terms of the overall package, there are deficiencies when you compare him to the other 3 drivers. For one, he is a crash-prone driver, it's as simple as that. Now, many Leclerc fans say online that his crashes are only down to him overdriving to get the most performance out of the car, but the ability to walk that tightrope of living right on the edge but not going over it, that is what the best drivers can do. And crashing can't always be an excuse that you're actually driving so well and it's just the car's fault that it ended up in the barrier. Although I think his recent form makes him look worse than he really is, it has been a bit confusing and difficult to judge. In Monaco he looked great, but then was obviously at fault for slowing down Lando. Spain seems to be a mystery to everyone in terms of or was there or wasn't there something wrong with the car? And even Canada, although the team didn't help him by not putting him on the slicks earlier, there were other drivers around him who went on the slicks at a similar time, including Carlos, that did manage to set a good enough lap time to get into Q3. I am not saying that Ferrari are blameless, but it would be lying to say that Leclerc has no fault and had no chance of getting into Q3. Leclerc is difficult because we know that he has the speed and we know that he has the talent, but there is still so many questions. How much of it is him? How much of it is Ferrari? Or what would he learn from the first half of 2022 if he was given a championship level car again? And what would he be like in a Red Bull or Mercedes environment? I believe that one day he is going to be a world champion, but I can't sit here right now and say that overall he is as good of a driver as the likes of Hamilton or Verstappen. Or whatever the case, up at the front we have a great group of quality drivers who all deserve to be there. But to me, in terms of speed, consistency, and the ability to do it under pressure, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and Fernando Alonso, they are currently in a league of their own compared to the rest of the grid. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.